Before Rome, before the Caesars, there were the Berbers and Phoenicians, kings obsessed with pebbles, robes, and perfumes, ruling quietly in the desert sun. Let's wander their hypnotic, eccentric courts. Part 1. The Untold Legacy of North Africa's Berber and Phoenician Kings. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a gentle drift into the distant sands of North Africa. So, dim the lights, get cozy, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's float back a few thousand years. Imagine the sun lazily creeping over the desert dunes while ancient cities of mud brick and stone slowly come to life. That's our stage. And on that stage, the players are kings and queens whose names you might not remember tomorrow, but whose lives were, well, let's say unusually complicated in ways that somehow never make it into your standard history textbook. We'll start with the Phoenicians. Yes, those slick seafarers with a flair for purple dye, tiny boats, and long-distance trade. Carthage, the most famous of their colonial creations, was born from their restless energy. You might think of them as neat and organized, which, to be fair, they were in their accounting and shipping. But when it came to their rulers, they could be a little eccentric. And I mean that in a mildly tragic, almost sleepy way. Take King Hanno, often called Hanno the Navigator, not to be confused with the more action-packed explorers you read about in school. Hanno's expeditions are notable mostly for being tediously long, geographically confusing, and ending with him scribbling detailed lists of things we sort of saw. He loved to map coastlines, noting every mountain and every river. But his diary-style documentation suggests he might have been the world's first chronic overthinker. For example, he would write things like, "Encountered a village. People seemed fine. They had goats. Noted the goats." Riveting stuff, really. And somehow this meticulous note-taking became legendary, though perhaps more for its monotony than its navigational brilliance. Of course, Hanno wasn't the only ruler with a peculiar streak. Fast forward a few decades, or maybe centuries, timelines in ancient North Africa are fuzzy like a sandstorm, and we meet the Berber kings. Now, the Berbers, the indigenous people of the region, had their own dynasties and quirks. One of the more charming oddities was how intensely personal loyalty mattered. A Berber king wasn't just a distant figurehead. He would wander the desert, talking to his subjects, checking on livestock, and occasionally getting lost in sandstorms. And when a king got lost, well, the entire court would panic mildly for a few days before calmly resuming their lives. Because why not double down on daily existential worry? Some Berber rulers had habits that make you want to curl up with a pillow and sigh. For instance, there was a king whose favorite pastime was collecting tiny stones from the desert. He would arrange them meticulously in geometric patterns around his palace. Not because they had mystical powers, but because he genuinely enjoyed the symmetry. His court spent weeks copying his stone arrangements for practice, which sounds mildly exhausting, but at least nobody was getting hurt. Intermarriage was another sleepy, endlessly fascinating element. You see, both Phoenician and Berber elites had this charming habit of marrying within a very tight circle of nobility. Not in a dramatic love triangle sense, but in a subtle, let's keep all the land, titles, and goats in the family sense. This resulted in some of the most peculiar family trees you could imagine. Cousins marrying cousins, aunts marrying nephews. It was less about scandal and more about, efficient property management. And the side effect? Children with unusual traits and sometimes very delicate health. Imagine tiny princes and princesses, all well-dressed, polite, but prone to fainting whenever the sun was a little too bright. Let's pause and float over to another royal disaster, or rather, a quiet, almost soothing example of dynastic oddness. King Massinissa of Numidia, for instance, had an absolutely serene obsession with livestock management.
While his neighbors were plotting wars or building temples, he was meticulously cataloging his sheep, assigning each a name, and occasionally rearranging the herds according to celestial patterns. You can almost hear the gentle sigh of his advisors, quietly nodding in approval, and thinking, yes, this is exactly why we accepted our royal stipends. But even the most gentle kings had their dramatic sides. Queen Sophonisba, for example, was a Phoenician woman married into the Berber elite. She had to navigate the tricky waters of political alliances, which mostly involved saying polite things at feasts, smiling at generals, and occasionally frowning just enough to signal her displeasure without causing a panic. She reportedly had a fondness for perfumed oils and could spend entire afternoons trying to decide which scent best reflected her current mood. Now, in most historical accounts, this might sound frivolous, but when your life consists of endless negotiations, perfumed oils are basically essential diplomatic tools. Interestingly, these North African courts were also theaters for emotional eccentricities. Berber kings could display temperaments that were both mildly amusing and slightly tragic. There was one ruler who would sulk in his tent for entire days because a ceremonial robe wasn't folded to his exact liking. Not rebellious sulking, mind you, just quiet, dignified dissatisfaction. Courtiers would whisper among themselves, "It's okay, he'll come out when the robe pleases him," and go about their tea. There's something almost hypnotic about the slow rhythm of these minor royal meltdowns. It's like watching someone carefully knit a sweater that will never be worn and thinking, yes, this is the essence of governance. And then there's the poetic irony of succession. You'd imagine that with all the careful planning, dynasties would be smooth-running machines, but often the result was a sleepy, slightly chaotic succession drama. A king would die, peacefully, usually in his sleep, and suddenly everyone had an opinion on who should inherit. Sons, nephews, cousins, former goat collectors all had claims. And rather than descending into bloody conflict, most of the time they'd just argue quietly over maps, livestock, and ceremonial robes until someone sighed and said, "Fine, you can be king. Just please stop folding the robes like that." Phoenician influence is another layer of gently amusing complexity. These merchants turned rulers were obsessed with trade, shipping, and records. So when a Berber king tried to implement his own bizarre herding geometries or robe folding ceremonies, Phoenician advisors would make careful notes, trying to convert everything into charts, ledgers, and graphs. This clash of pastoral whimsy and merchant precision is, in retrospect, almost soothing. It's as if the entire region existed in a slow-motion ballet of mild eccentricity. Let's linger on one more minor curiosity before we slowly drift forward. There was a Berber prince who took a particular interest in local mythology. Every evening, he would sit in his courtyard, smoke mild herbs, and recite stories of gods and spirits that only he seemed to understand completely. His tutors tried to correct him, thinking he was misremembering. But the prince was firm. He was not misremembering, he was innovating. And so, quietly, a new version of local legend was born, slightly eccentric, occasionally nonsensical, but with perfect poetic cadence. One could imagine him lying back, watching the stars, muttering, "Yes, this is exactly how the gods would want it." So, if we take a step back and breathe in the atmosphere of these ancient courts, what do we see? Not epic battles, not sweeping conquests, not heroic adventures. Instead, we see a world of subtle oddities, gentle eccentricities, and personal quirks amplified by wealth, title, and dynastic pressure. A world where stone arrangements, perfumed oils, and embroidered robes mattered as much as gold and territory. And perhaps that's what makes the legacy of North Africa's Berber and Phoenician kings quietly mesmerizing, not because it shocks or thrills, but because it hums along in a hypnotic rhythm, slightly off-kilter, yet strangely comforting. And with that, we can slowly let our minds wander across the desert sands, imagining these ancient courts, these rulers who preferred symmetry, scent, and subtle power plays, drifting off into a gentle historical slumber. Tomorrow, or maybe later, we'll meet more of these quietly extraordinary figures and explore the subtle tragedies and mild absurdities that made their lives so distinctively human.
Part 2. From Carthage to Numidia. Royals who kept it weird. All right, let's drift back into the warm sands, letting the gentle breeze carry us toward the lands of Carthage and Numidia. If you're still settling into that comfy spot on the couch or bed, this is exactly the right moment. We'll float through ancient cities, courts, and palaces where the rulers' eccentricities were less grand spectacle and more slowly simmering weirdness, the kind that could lull you into a soft historical nap, if you try hard enough. Let's start with Hamilcar Barca, not to be confused with anyone else in the famously prolific Barca family. Hamilcar was a Phoenician general who, when not plotting battles or, expanding Carthaginian influence, had a mild obsession with family reputation. And by mild, I mean he took it very seriously, to the point of recording every minor embarrassment for posterity. His children were carefully educated, mostly in a quiet, slightly tense environment, where mistakes were noted in ink and minorly frowned upon, rather than punished with dramatic flair. It's the kind of upbringing that produces children who are polite, extremely competent, and slightly neurotic. A very sleepy kind of tragedy, really. Hamilcar's eldest son, Hannibal, is of course famous for crossing the Alps with elephants. But before that dramatic march, which you may have learned about in school, Hannibal's early years were mostly filled with tedious drills, long walks, and detailed lectures on loyalty and discipline. One story, recounted with mild admiration by ancient historians, describes young Hannibal listening to his father describe the horrors of betrayal while simultaneously making elaborate drawings of geometric patterns in the sand. It's almost poetic. The seeds of strategy and obsession planted in a boy who would later become one of history's most admired military minds, yet still somehow remarkably calm in his daily routine. Meanwhile, in Numidia, we have King Galla, whose rule was notable mostly for his extreme attention to ceremonial details. Gallo would spend hours inspecting palace guards, making sure their armor reflected just the right light during parades. He also had a peculiar fondness for counting. Not taxes, not armies, just counting things. Pebbles, grains of sand, goats. Sometimes he would even count the clouds. And when he miscounted, he would sigh audibly and start again. Historians note that this didn't destabilize his kingdom, but it did create an atmosphere of gentle, mildly obsessive precision that permeated the court. Courtiers, over time, simply accepted it, muttering things like, "It's fine, he'll finish when he finishes," which is the sort of patience that ancient governments rarely get credit for. Now intermarriage again comes to play. Phoenician and Berber elites were surprisingly consistent in their strategies of keeping power and land within their circle. Marriages were rarely romantic. They were carefully choreographed moves in a slow, methodical chess game, and the consequences were often interesting. One Berber princess married her cousin, a prince so delicate that historians describe him as prone to fainting in warm weather, or even in particularly sunny rooms. She, on the other hand, had a fondness for early morning walks, where she would examine the palace gardens for aesthetic flaws. Together, they formed a quietly tragic, yet oddly peaceful household. him reclining on fainting couches, her sighing over misaligned flowers, and everyone else tiptoeing politely around the eccentricities. One of the more peculiar dynastic quirks involved personal pets. Numidian and Phoenician rulers often had animals that were treated almost as junior courtiers. Elephants, lions, and rare birds were common. King Massinissa, for instance, reportedly had a pet monkey who lived in the royal quarters and was allowed to interfere mildly in ceremonial functions. The monkey didn't overthrow the court, of course, but its presence created a gentle sense of unpredictability that was probably more amusing than alarming. Courtiers would tell stories about the monkey's political interventions, which mostly involved stealing fruit from advisors' desks and occasionally nodding as if to approve or disapprove of minor proclamations. Now let's drift toward the quieter tragedies of royal children. Being born into a Phoenician or Berber royal family was not an adrenaline-fueled adventure. It was more a slow-motion study of constraint and expectation. Young princes and princesses were trained in languages, arithmetic, modest swordplay, and etiquette. They were expected to sit quietly, listen carefully, and occasionally faint in dramatic but controlled ways when confronted with mild emotional stress. Sickness was common, partially due to inbreeding, partially due to the general delicacy of living in stone palaces under desert heat. And yet the children often survived long enough to continue the dynastic chain, which is kind of impressive if you think about it in a sleepy, bemused way. Sophonisba, who we met earlier, is worth revisiting here because her life encapsulates much of this slow, tragic elegance. She had to navigate the complex currents of Carthaginian and Numidian politics while maintaining a calm, polished presence. She reportedly had a fondness for perfumes and oils that rivaled any modern enthusiast. Entire afternoons were spent deciding which scent best reflected the political nuance of the day. A gentle breeze, a subtle nod, a mildly amused smile. These were her weapons, not swords or armies, just scent and etiquette. And remarkably, it mostly worked. She managed to wield influence quietly, leaving a legacy not of dramatic conquest, but of subtle elegance and mild intrigue. Meanwhile, in Carthage, the later generations of Barca descendants developed peculiar hobbies that historians almost whisper about. One prince, for instance, had a hobby of arranging shells from the Mediterranean in what he called patterns of destiny. He would walk along the shore, pick up shells, and arrange them in spirals or lines that represented family fortunes, alliances, and hypothetical military campaigns. Courtiers and servants accepted this quietly, partly out of respect, partly out of mild exhaustion. It was not a threatening obsession, just a quiet eccentricity that somehow became legendary. And then there's the fascinating interplay of culture. Phoenician influence brought elaborate writing, trade networks, and temples. Berber culture contributed local religious rituals, intimate knowledge of the desert, and, of course, some of the most surprisingly mild eccentricities in history. When these elements combined, the result was a slow-moving court drama where robes, scents, pebbles, and minor fainting episodes could carry the weight of dynastic importance. It's like watching history unfold in a slightly tilted, very relaxed teacup. Nothing explodes, everything slowly spins. Even the ceremonial robes deserve a gentle sigh. Numidian kings were obsessed with patterns and materials. Certain colors were reserved for specific festivals or seasons. A misfolded robe could trigger mild distress. The court learned to fold everything in advance, just in case. There are accounts of advisors practicing folding in secret,
quietly dreaming of robes that would never exist, while the kings inspected fabrics with a solemn, almost sleepy dignity. And speaking of fabric, textile trade was another curious point of Phoenician influence. Carthaginian rulers were meticulous about maintaining networks for dyes, linens, and silks, but rather than dramatic wars for territory, much of the intrigue revolved around slow negotiations over quality, shade, and shipment schedules. It's the kind of politics that's easy to forget exists in history books, but imagine sitting quietly for hours, sipping tea, debating the precise tone of a purple garment. It's basically the slowest, most polite chess game ever recorded. We can't ignore religion either. Both Berber and Phoenician rulers engaged in ritual, sometimes elaborate, often quiet. Temples existed, yes, but many kings preferred private rituals in the courtyard. Some had small altars with incense, perfumed oils, and gently arranged stones, because why not combine your minor obsessions with a sense of spiritual calm? In fact, many of these rituals were probably more about personal rhythm than divine intercession. A king lighting incense while counting goats or arranging pebbles seems absurd, but it provided structure in lives otherwise filled with ceremony.
Part 3. Royal Eccentricities and Quiet Tragedies of North Africa. All right, let's gently float back into the sun-warmed courts of ancient North Africa. By now, if you're reclining comfortably, you might notice your mind drifting with the slow rhythm of history. That's exactly what we want. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic battles or heroic feats. We're lingering in the quiet corners of palaces, walking alongside princes counting pebbles, princesses smelling perfumes, and kings sighing over misfolded robes. It's calm, a little sad, and just a touch absurd. Let's start with King Jugurtha of Numidia, a man whose life was remarkable mostly because of its quiet complexity. He came to power through inheritance and careful maneuvering, not through any particularly dramatic display of prowess. But Jugurtha had a personal obsession that deserves our sleepy attention: record-keeping. Every minor interaction, every gift, every minor slight or compliment he received was meticulously documented. He carried small tablets with him everywhere, making notes in ink that, frankly, could have put a modern bureaucrat to shame. The result? A personal archive that historians still find fascinating, not because it's dramatic, but because it's profoundly meticulous. Imagine someone living centuries ago, walking across the desert with a tiny notebook, jotting down the exact arrangement of ceremonial robes at a feast, and occasionally noting, "Minor cousin smiled awkwardly, unclear intent." Riveting in the most soporific way. And then there was the curious case of King Misipsa, Jugurtha's predecessor. Misipsa's life was marked by deliberate, almost meditative pacing. He would host banquets that lasted days, not because they were extravagantly entertaining, but because he enjoyed observing subtle social dynamics, cataloging the behavior of each guest, and occasionally sighing softly at minor infractions. Courtiers learned to anticipate his sighs and respond appropriately. It was like an ancient, very slow game of Simon Says, where the stakes were polite attention rather than life and death. Phoenician rulers, of course, had their own brand of low-key eccentricity. Take Hasdrubal, for example. Not to be confused with anyone else in the very prolific Hasdrubal family, this particular Hasdrubal had a subtle obsession with shipping schedules. His obsession was so precise that he would review boat departures and arrivals daily, sometimes multiple times a day, noting minor discrepancies in logs. And when a ship arrived an hour late, he would simply sigh, adjust his notes, and continue as though the world's equilibrium depended entirely on this minor temporal discrepancy.
which, in a way, it did for him. The gentle rhythm of obsessive order versus unpredictable human behavior plays out again, quietly, in the sunlit offices of Carthage. Let's pause to drift into a slightly more domestic scene. Princesses and queens often had hobbies that are historically delightful in their slow, meticulous nature. One Berber queen, for instance, became mildly famous for her embroidery. Not ordinary embroidery, mind you. These were tapestries depicting abstract patterns representing family histories. Each thread symbolized a minor event, a birthday, a political alliance, a goat counted incorrectly, a robe misfolded. Historians note that the queen would occasionally pause, examine a thread, and mutter softly about the balance being slightly off. It's like a quiet, obsessive meditation expressed through fabric. And then there was the gentle tragedy of health and heredity. Inbreeding was common among the elite, which sometimes produced subtle physical peculiarities and chronic illnesses. Children could be unusually delicate or prone to fainting. Nothing catastrophic, just slightly inconvenient for running a dynasty. Imagine a young prince pausing mid-lesson to lean against a column while a tutor sighs calmly and makes a note, "Fainting episode number 3. Sun slightly brighter than acceptable." Courtiers learned patience in these slow, almost ceremonial interruptions. Another example of personal eccentricity comes from the Numidian court. King Bocchus I, who had a mild obsession with geometry. Not mathematics in the modern sense, but arranging stones, columns, and even livestock in pleasing patterns. He believed that visual harmony translated into political stability. Every morning he would walk the palace gardens, adjust a stone here, nudge a goat there, and murmur, "Much better, much better." The courtiers, over time, stopped questioning this practice. It became part of the gentle rhythm of palace life. A slow dance of obsession, entirely non-threatening, yet oddly mesmerizing. Back to Carthage, we see a similar pattern with political maneuvering. Phoenician rulers were often careful, strategic, and, quietly, obsessed with record-keeping. The famous suffates, essentially the Carthaginian executive officials, would spend hours reviewing trade logs, letters, and ceremonial records. Their lives were full of minor tensions. Who received which gift, which shipment arrived late, which neighbor sent a slightly off-kilter tribute. None of it caused dramatic upheaval. Instead, it created a slow, deliberate rhythm of governance, a ballet of meticulous attention that's surprisingly soothing to imagine. Let's pause to drift into a slightly more domestic scene. Durations were family dynamics, yet which are endlessly intriguing. Marriages were arranged to consolidate power, maintain land, and ensure smooth succession. But sometimes personalities clashed. One Berber prince was extraordinarily delicate, prone to fainting or mild illness if upset. His bride, a Phoenician princess, had a fondness for walking silently through the gardens, examining the sunlight on the palace walls. Together they formed a household of gentle, passive eccentricity. Him reclining quietly, her inspecting shadows, and everyone else navigating these minor quirks with polite resignation. Even ceremonial customs were infused with mild absurdity. Numidian kings could spend hours adjusting robes, arranging courtiers, and observing the alignment of incense sticks. If anything was slightly off, there would be a pause, a sigh, a minor corrective action. Nothing catastrophic, just a rhythm, slowly unfolding, where etiquette and obsessive detail held as much power as armies or coins. You can almost hear the monotone narration of the palace chronicler. He adjusted the robe. He nodded. The ceremony continued, slightly better now. Pets, of course, continued to play their curious role. Elephants, lions, and small exotic birds were common in palaces, but their roles were almost ceremonial. King Massinisa's monkey, for instance, became mildly famous for voting on minor court decisions. Of course, the monkey had no real influence, but the ritual of its presence provided amusement and rhythm. Advisors would quietly adjust their plans based on where the monkey chose to perch. It's the kind of anecdote that makes history feel human, slow, and oddly comforting. Religion, similarly, was both ritualistic and quietly personalized. Berber and Phoenician kings maintained temples and public ceremonies, but often preferred private contemplative worship. A small altar, a few scented oils, and carefully arranged stones could occupy a king's attention for hours, not out of fanaticism, but out of a subtle need for structure and reflection. Lighting incense while counting goats, adjusting robes, or arranging pebbles, this was the gentle meditation of North African rulers. And let's not forget the minor domestic dramas. Children, tutors, and minor courtiers all navigated a world where fainting spells, obsessive hobbies, and subtle sighs were the norm. A young prince might pause mid-lesson to faint in dramatic but controlled fashion. A tutor would calmly note the event and resume the lesson when the prince awoke. A princess might silently rearrange flowers to maintain harmony with the court's aesthetic. These were slow-moving, gentle dramas of everyday life that were far more subtle than epic battles, but no less fascinating. Interestingly, Carthaginian trade influenced the subtle psychology of the courts. Shipping records, logbooks, and correspondence demanded attention to minor details. Late shipments of purple dye could cause mild agitation. Incorrect measurements of grain could result in gentle sighs and readjustments. And yet, despite the potential for disruption, life continued in a slow, measured rhythm. Kings, queens, courtiers, and merchants all participated in this quiet dance, balancing practicality with eccentricity in ways that feel almost hypnotic to imagine. One of the more soothingly tragic stories involves succession disputes. Unlike dramatic conflicts in other regions,
Part 4. The Quiet Legacy of North Africa's Royals. All right, let's drift back one last time into the sun-warmed courts and desert palaces. By now, if you're reclining in a comfy chair or your bed, hopefully your eyelids are starting to feel that gentle pull of calm. This final segment will trace the closing threads of these ancient dynasties, highlighting the quirks, obsessions, and quiet legacies that somehow survived thousands of years of history, if only in slightly dusty records and subtle stories. Let's begin with the conclusion of Carthage's Phoenician rulers. Over generations, the Barca family continued to maintain their slow, deliberate rhythm. Their lives were a series of careful preparations, minor domestic dramas, and obsessive attention to personal and ceremonial details. Hannibal, whom we've met before, may have made headlines in history books for his Alps-crossing feat, but outside of that, he also meticulously recorded daily life, troop arrangements, and the precise folding of ceremonial banners. A general by necessity, yes, but a perfectionist in quieter matters as well. Imagine him poring over ledgers at twilight, carefully arranging reports while elephants trundle lazily in the background. A serene image, almost meditative. Meanwhile, in Numidia, successive kings continued patterns of subtle obsession. Bocchus, Massinissa, and their descendants cultivated courtyards, arranged stones, counted livestock, and measured incense lines with a precision bordering on the obsessive, but not in a way that disrupted their kingdoms.
Their eccentricities were quiet, almost rhythmic, like a slow pulse beneath the desert sun. Courtiers learned to anticipate their moods, adjusting subtly, and life moved forward in a calm, hypnotic loop. Let's consider the role of minor tragedies, not the kind that ends wars, but the sort that gently shapes personal lives. Children of these dynasties were often delicate, partly due to inbreeding, partly due to the inherent fragility of palace life. Fainting spells, chronic ailments, and occasional emotional meltdowns were common. But instead of chaos, these incidents were woven into the daily rhythm. A sigh, a gentle adjustment of robes, a note in the ledger, and life went on. It's a quietly human sort of drama, subtle enough to soothe rather than startle, yet fascinating in its slow-motion complexity. And then there are the queens and princesses, whose influence was less about wielding armies and more about maintaining the delicate balance of court life. Sophonisba, for example, navigated politics through perfumed oils, silent gestures, and quiet observation. Her power lay in subtlety, a perfectly chosen scent, a measured smile, or a carefully directed frown could influence alliances and decisions. There's a kind of hypnotic beauty in imagining a palace where influence is wielded not with swords, but with elegance and observation. Now, we can't ignore pets, minor obsessions, and ceremonial peculiarities. They're a gentle heartbeat of royal life. Elephants wandered leisurely through courtyards, monkeys meddled in minor ceremonies, and exotic birds occasionally disrupted meditative stone arrangements. Kings and queens indulged in obsessive hobbies, geometric layouts of stones, counting clouds, examining sunlight on walls, or meticulously folding robes. To modern eyes, it might seem absurd, but in context, these were the rituals that kept the rhythm of power and life gently in motion. Succession, too, followed this calm pattern. Unlike the dramatic upheavals of other regions, North African dynasties often resolved disputes through patient negotiation and subtle persuasion. Sons, nephews, and cousins would quietly assert their claims, sometimes over minor ceremonial privileges, sometimes over the arrangement of robes or allocation of perfumed oils. No bloodshed, no clash of armies, just slow, deliberate negotiation. And when agreement was reached, life continued, slightly altered, but gently persistent. Phoenician influence added another layer of calm complexity. Trade networks, detailed logbooks, and maritime records required quiet attention. A miscounted shipment of dye or grain might provoke a sigh, a ledger adjustment, or a mildly annoyed note, but no one panicked. The rhythm of trade, administration, and ceremonial obligation intertwined, creating a hypnotic, measured life that seems almost soothing when imagined in detail. We can also consider the quieter cultural legacies. Kings and queens, through obsessive hobbies and personal eccentricities, influenced art, architecture, and daily rituals. The geometric layouts of gardens, the precise alignment of palace stones, the careful choice of colors and scents, all of this left subtle traces in culture and memory. These are not monumental achievements in the traditional sense. They did not reshape continents or topple empires, but they endured, quietly shaping the aesthetic and social fabric of the region. Religion, as always, was a mix of public obligation and private ritual. Kings performed ceremonies, offered incense, and maintained altars, but often in ways deeply personalized. Lighting incense while counting pebbles, arranging herds, or adjusting robes was both meditative and mildly obsessive. Priests, courtiers, and advisors participated, guided by tradition but also by patience, creating a gentle rhythm that sustained the court and perhaps the ruler's own mental equilibrium. And then there's the small human drama of emotion and personality. Courtiers navigated fainting princes, meticulous queens, obsessive kings, and minor domestic catastrophes with polite resignation. Minor frustrations, the wrong alignment of stones, a slightly off scent, a misplaced robe, were met with quiet correction. The pace was deliberate, measured, almost hypnotic. And through it all, life continued. A child might faint, a monkey might interfere, a shipment of purple dye might arrive late, but kingdoms endured, quietly, persistently, and eccentrically. Let's linger on one final set of eccentricities. Some kings collected small, natural objects, stones, shells, or feathers. Others arranged gardens according to patterns only they fully understood. Minor rituals like daily inspections of guards, careful counting of livestock, or selecting perfumes to match subtle shifts in political mood dominated everyday life. It's a sort of hypnotic domesticity where the trivial and the ceremonial intertwine. The effect is both mesmerizing and soporific, a historical lullaby for anyone paying close attention. We can also consider the gentle tragedies of mortality. Many rulers died in relative calm, leaving heirs to continue the rhythm of court life. Children trained in etiquette, minor arts, and personal obsession management inherited these slowly unfolding dynastic patterns. There was no rush, no grand spectacle, just a quiet continuation of tradition, hobby, and subtle obsession. Life moved forward, one carefully folded robe, one arranged pebble, one counted cloud at a time. By now, you might notice the overall pattern. These rulers were less concerned with conquest than with structure, less concerned with war than with the meticulous management of daily life. Their eccentricities, whether counting pebbles, folding robes, arranging gardens, or smelling oils, became the rhythm of governance, the hypnotic pulse of their courts. They leave a legacy not of epic drama, but of gentle, human peculiarities preserved in the margins of history. And finally, imagine the desert at dusk. The sun sets slowly, casting long shadows over palace gardens and stone courtyards. Kings adjust stones, queens smell oils, princes practice polite fainting, and monkeys meddle quietly. Trade logs are reviewed, ceremonial robes are folded, incense is burned. It is not a world of drama, violence, or sudden shocks. It is